What's going on? What is happening, everybody? What is happening? How's everybody doing? Let me know if you're in the chat. So we're going to be talking about epistemology, which is how can we verify that we know? How do we know? How can we know about anything, right? By the way, let me know. I know this is extremely awkward. I'm still getting used to this, even though it's been years, I guess, thinking about this. But yeah, if you're in the chat, let me know that you're in the chat. All right. Anyways. All right, so principles of epistemology and logic. Let's talk about the principles of epistemology and logic. So these principles govern how we know, how we reason, and how we test truth. They keep us out of equivocation. Right? Equivocation is being completely wrong about something, right? How we avoid sloppy inferences, incredulity, especially in history, miracles, and worldview debates. So if we don't lock these down, we don't get dialogue. We get vibes and word games and rhetorical wins that never touch reality. All right, so let's start with clarity and argument structure. So when we're debating people, when we're talking to people, when we are comparing worldviews and different positions, when we're trying to basically dialogue with someone that has a different take on a given subject, right? And we're trying to reconcile our different points of view, when we're trying to agree, when we have different points of view, different takes on a given subject. One of the things that we need to build common ground. That's the first step. I mean, I've tried different ways of doing things, and the only thing I found that has any success is, instead of trying to reconcile and bridge the gap between two different points of view, I find it's better to retreat to a common ground, right? And then build from there. And that will make the point of disagreement, it'll make it more precise, right? And it'll make it smaller, so it's easier to address. But yeah, so one of the things that gets lost early in argumentation and discussion is definitions of words, right? So the classic, faith word. People who are opposed to any given faith will often treat faith as if it was blind credulity, whereas someone that has faith, their faith is based on they can point to whether it be experiential experiential data or historical data or a combination, and they can say, this is why I believe what I believe, and I'm faithful to this belief, right? Revelation. This is especially true in the Judeo-Christian tradition. So let's talk about clarity and argument structure. So epistemology 1, principle of definition: fix meanings first. Fix meanings before you debate. Without clear definitions, arguments collapse into word games. Most debates are secretly fights over shifting terms. Someone attacks one meaning while the other side defends a different meaning, and everyone walks away thinking they won. That's not reasoning. That's bait and switch, powered by semantics and scope drift, equivocation, and other errors. So the classic example is faith, because faith can mean trust grounded in evidence, or it can mean blind credulity. So a skeptic will attack blind credulity, while believers defend trust grounded in evidence. So this matters because precision prevents word games, semantics, and scope drift, right? Equivocation, and it keeps disagreements stable long enough to stress test them. So it's important to be able to understand the point of disagreement before trying to move hastily to try to resolve that disagreement. It's worthwhile to just endeavor to be precise about the point of disagreement, understand its shape, its contours, its form, its limitations, and then sit with the disagreement for a while. Be able to come back to it, right? Because if the point of disagreement is really weak, it will crumble. It will crumble. What's happening, everybody? If you're in the chat, say hi. Patience. And then sit with the disagreement for a while. Be able to come back to it, right? Because if the point of disagreement is really weak, it will crumble. It will crumble. Anyways. Hey, RNXH, what is that? XH1RS. I haven't seen you before, but shout out to RN. Let me know, how, if you're having a good time here. Okay, so that is the principle of definition. Let's talk about the principle of premises. Garbage in, garbage out. So, conclusions depend on starting points. False, incoherent, or smuggled premises doom the argument. So you can build a perfectly coherent fantasy world starting from bad premises. It can feel logical, but it'll fail the moment it has to carry reality. This is why you always interrogate premises, not just conclusions, right? When you're evaluating a conclusion or of any sort, you want to evaluate the premises also, right? If you are presented with an argument, evaluate, and we'll talk a lot about argumentation. That's a whole different subject. Syllogisms and all that. So faulty premise logic often hides inside patterns like, when it rains, the ground is wet. The ground is wet, therefore it rained. So that conclusion does not necessarily follow. That ground could be wet because a sprinkler ran or someone washed the car or whatever. You have to test premises, right? If you don't test premises, you end up defending conclusions that only look strong because the starting points were never challenged. All right. Now we're going to talk about valid inferences, the bridge from premise to conclusion. So this is Epistemology 3, the principle of valid inferences. Valid inference preserves truth. If the premises are true, the conclusion follows. This is the bridge. Even true premises don't guarantee a true conclusion if the bridge is broken. So our job is to make the structure tight enough that a fair opponent is forced to respect the conclusion if they grant the premise. For instance, a good argument, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, right? So we have the term, man. We have the term, man is distributed as all men are, and the predicate of men right here is mortal, okay? This predictable characteristic of men, mortality, is shared across all men. Okay, so Socrates is a part of the class men, right? Therefore, if Socrates is a part of the class men and the term men is distributed across all, right? And the predicate mortal is true of all men. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. So that's a valid bridge and a valid argument. So this prevents irrational leaps and protects us from being emotionally impressed by bad logic. All right, let's talk about evidence, probability, and disciplined explanation. So we have to talk about the principle of evidence proportion. We have to match confidence to support. Confidence should match support, neither gullibility nor total skepticism. So let's talk about gullibility, which is believing everything, and total skepticism, which is not believing anything. These are two pathologies, credulity and cynicism. The mean between two extremes is disciplined confidence. Multiple independent, competent witnesses should move your confidence more than a rumor. Okay? A hunch is not proof. And demanding impossible certainty is not rigor. It's a trapdoor into permanent disbelief. So multiple independent witnesses is greater than one rumor. A hunch is not a proof. This keeps us out of naive belief and out of performative skepticism. All right, Epistemology 5, principle of data versus evidential talk. Separate facts from hand-waving. Separate evidence from claims about what would be likely or unlikely. We have to separate these. So a huge amount of philosophy is not evidence, it's atmosphere. Saying it's conceivable there were many other psychophysical regimes is not evidence. It's a setup that still needs justification. If someone says there could be infinite worlds, that is not data. We see one reality. Don't let people swap out data for mood. It's conceivable there were many other psychophysical regimes is not evidence by itself. It's a claim that still needs argument and support. This prevents a vibe as evidence and stops debates from becoming intuition contests. All right. Epistemology's sixth principle of likelihood, predictive fit to the data. If this hypothesis were true, would the evidence be expected? The likelihood idea is simple. You start with a hypothesis and then ask what we should expect to see if it's true. The better a hypothesis predicts the actual facts, naturally, without duct tape patches, the stronger it is. And if two people ran different procedures but got the same relevant outcome, you don't get to pretend it's different evidence. Evidence is what actually happened, not a ghost story about what could have happened. For example, if the events at Fatima in 1917 were a public miracle, you would expect documentation, independent corroboration, durable reporting, and coherence with the context. If the rival hypothesis is mass hallucination, you have to explain why crowds report a shared public phenomena in a way that matches external reporting and downstream consequences. So the explanation tethered to evidence instead of just rhetoric. Right? This is data that fits the predictions. So this is the principle of likelihood, predictive fit to the data. All right, next we have the principle of measure. Fair odds talk requires a counting rule. If someone says improbable, they owe counting. They owe an accounting. What possibilities are counted and why that way? So countless conceivable alternatives, therefore unlikely, is often just smuggled theater. Unless someone can define the space of alternatives and justify the measure, probability talk is costume jewelry. So calling Fatima a freak atmospheric event only works if you can show that freak atmospheric events occur in the relevant way at the relevant time, tied to relevant predictions with relevant public observability. Otherwise, it's not probability, it's just a label. So this stops bogus probability talk dressed up as rigor. Epistemology 8, principle of modality discipline. Conceivable does not equal possible, does not equal probable. Don't slide from I can imagine it to it's a live possibility to it's unlikely to it's likely without argument. So this is one of the most common tricks in worldview debates. People jump from imagination to probability without building a bridge. You need modal discipline. Speculative stays speculative. Plausible stays plausible. Probable stays probable. Best explanation stays best explanation. Demonstrated stays demonstrated. You can't jump from one category of, probability to another. Otherwise, I can imagine X becomes a universal solvent. So if you don't maintain modality discipline, it becomes a universal solvent that dissolves any conclusion they dislike, right? They just move the type of likelihood at will to fit their agenda. So retreating to maybe there are infinite universe to dissolve fine-tuning is not evidence by itself. It's a modal move that must be argued and supported, not assumed. This matters because it prevents modal smuggling, one of the most common philosophical escape hatches. All right, now we're going to talk about testimony and historical reasoning. The principle of testimony: most knowledge is mediated. So most knowledge comes from credible witnesses. History, law, and science rely on testimony, not only personal replication. So if you treat testimony as basically hearsay, you nuke most human knowledge. Juries convict on witness testimony. Students trust results they did not reproduce. You can be critical without becoming absurd. Courts rely on testimony. Students trust transmitted results they didn't replicate. So treating testimony as worthless destroys history, law, and most science communication. So there has to be some amount, a standard amount of trust placed on, historical evidence, right? I'm not saying be, overly naive and and have like way too much credulity, right? There's a balance. But if you have multiple lines, multiple witnesses, multiple lines of evidence, multiple attestation, you can have confidence in that testimony, right? For and against, like if you look at something that is really controversial, like 9/11, Epstein files, whatever, there are opposing sides to those arguments, right? There are people that say that it was a conspiracy and people that say, that it's fake news. You can evaluate those arguments and you can evaluate the interests of opposing sides of those arguments. So when you evaluate testimony and witnesses, of course it's important to know the motivation behind that. But those things can, like a physics professor from Alaska with no interest in 9/11 saying that, he demonstrates that it was a controlled demolition. A group of architects and engineers that go through great pains to say that that was a controlled demolition. That's credible evidence, Anyways. All right, we're going to talk about multiple attestation. Wait. All right, we're going to talk about the principle of testimony, weight, independence, and chain of custody. So weigh testimony by independence versus copying, proximity, hearsay layers, name detail, chain of custody. So 10 people repeating one source is not 10 independent witnesses. Independence is everything. Named details matter. Proximity matters. Chain of custody matters. 10 people repeating one source does not equal 10 independent witnesses. This prevents inflated counts and flattened differences. Okay, the principle of multiple attestation. Convergence increases credibility. Independent convergence increases credibility. Truth doesn't require word-for-word identity. Independent witnesses can differ in angle and still converge on the same reality. The kind of convergence reduces the probability of collusion, copying, or invention. Converging sources reduce collusion and invention risk. Convergence is a major historical reinforcement. Principle of early testimony, less time for legend. So closer to the event equals less legend window. Hey everybody, somebody's in the chat. How you doing? So the early testimony has less time for legend. If you're closer to the event, there's less of a window for myth making. So the longer the gap, the more room you have for distortion, memory drift, embellishment, selective editing, and outright fabrication. Early first-hand testimony beats late third-hand retellings. Earlier reporting usually, beats third-hand reporting. It reduces distortion and fabrication time. And all of these are going to be very important when we evaluate history. All right? Okay, so let's talk about the principle of enemy or against interest attestation. Hostile admissions weigh more. So admissions from opponents carry special weight, special type of weight. If a hostile source concedes a core point, you don't treat that like friendly propaganda. Against interest testimony is harder to explain away because it runs against motive. For instance, the Babylonian Talmud contains hostile material about Jesus, but hostility itself can still function as evidence of acknowledgement rather than denial. It strengthens core claims by showing even opponents grant key elements. For instance, Flavius Josephus was saying that, Jesus was a doer of great deeds. And the Babylonian Talmud recognizes that Jesus, existed and had a following. All right, principle of embarrassment. Damaging details are less likely invented. So damaging details are less likely invented. They signal non-propaganda reporting. Propaganda smooths edges. Honest reporting includes failures, shame, confusion, and moral weakness. When writers report their own incompetence, cowardice, or humiliation, it's evidence against pure spin. So the Gospels include the apostles' failure and flight at the arrest of Jesus. This filters out simple, it's all propaganda explanations. The principle of coherence with context. Authenticity fits time and place. True claims fit their time and culture. False ones leak anachronisms. Anachronism is something outside of its time, like something that is anachronistic would be like if they were filming a film about ancient Rome and somebody had a wristwatch, right? Like that happened in Gladiator. So anachronism is a tell. Context becomes an authenticity filter, geography, language, customs, politics, local detail. And you already get this instinctively. Like in Inglourious Basterds, someone has, waves a hand gesture and gives someone away because it doesn't match the local cultural pattern. Like they were saying, what was it? Like 3 like this, and usually they do it like that or something. I have to go watch it again. Like usually this is how they do it, and then he did like this. I can't remember. But anyways, that's what blows their cover. Same idea. The false stories leak out of era tells, out of culture tells. So accurate local customs versus later world assumptions gives us context. And this filters authenticity and exposes invented narratives. Okay, theory, choice, and cumulative case reasoning. The principle of explanatory scope and power cover more with fewer patches. So prefer explanations that cover more data with fewer ad hoc patches. Judge against live rivals. So we're not comparing my favorite story to your favorite story. You're comparing live rivals under the same standard. The better explanation unifies more facts without patchwork escapes. So if a resurrection hypothesis explains multiple attested testimony, the rise of the community and costly witness, while rivals require separate patches, hallucination, body stolen, mass delusion, legend growth, conspiracy, mistaken identity, all of these stacked together, you don't call that equal. So it avoids patchwork thinking and forces rivals to pay their explanatory costs. So the principle of consilience. This is one of my favorite. This is the rope, not the single strand. The network, not just one line. Independent lines reinforce like strands of a rope. This is basically, our method. The method that I'm trying to present here is a consilience. It's a cumulative case. It's a network of arguments. So you don't hang the whole conclusion on one argument. Like we can braid cosmology, fine-tuning, origin of life, consciousness, moral realism, historical claims, miracles, lived transformation. And so the force comes from that convergence. So truth is often confirmed by multi-source convergence, not on one silver bullet. All right, the principle of economy. So we prefer the simplest explanation that actually carries the data with fewest ad hoc add-ons. So simple doesn't mean shallow. It means fewer untestable patches. When a view multiplies invisible entities just to dodge an inference, that's not humility, it's inflation. Explaining fine-tuning by positing countless unobservable universes may function as an escape hatch rather than an explanation, depending on what evidence is actually available for the mechanism. Simplicity is evidence when it still explains, right? prefer the simpler explanation. So, intellectual virtue and method boundaries. The principle of sincerity or integrity as evidence. Sincerity supports seriousness. Coherence of life and witness supports sincerity, not automatically truth. Costly witness doesn't prove a claim true, but it does reduce casual lying as an explanation. People can be wrong, but martyr level cost is not usually paid for something someone knows is a fraud or a lie. So steadfastness under cost suggests the witness isn't casually lying. This helps you evaluate motive and seriousness without overclaiming. Okay, the principle of truth affirmation, intellectual honesty is a duty. Truth seeking is a moral duty, not only a technique. Truth must be affirmed and falsity denied incrementally, relentlessly. If you want to combat mass confusion, you don't do it with takes. You do it with disciplined honesty over time, even when it costs you social points. Correcting your own side when wrong signals. Correcting your own side when you're wrong signals integrity. So without honesty, method becomes theater. Okay, the principle of methodological limits. Don't absolutize one method. Each method detects what it's built to detect. Don't absolutize one method. So a chemistry lab measures chemistry. It does not measure meaning, justice, or purpose. And if you want the method of religion, you have to include the religious act, prayer, repentance, worship, and sacramental life. Otherwise, you're demanding results from a method you refuse to run. So lab tests material causes. They don't test moral obligation or final causality directly. This matters because it prevents category errors and science-only imperialism. All right. So that is epistemology. Now we're going to go into teleology, principles of direction and purpose. I might stop streaming right now for a second.